On Tuesday, 4th March 1879, a young Irishwoman returned to Rose Gardens in Hammersmith for the first time in 6 years. She had friends in the London street, Harry Porter and his wife Anne, who she decided to visit and catch up with. With her was a young boy, her son. She would go on to become infamous. Kate Lawler, better known by her married name of Webster, had been born around 1849 at Killaan in County Wexford in Ireland. She had married when in her teens and had 4 children, all of whom had died in infancy. Her husband, who she claimed had been a sea captain called Webster, also died. This left her to fend for herself, so she turned to crime, including fraud and theft, and spent stints in jail in both Ireland and England, where she moved to in 1867. She was also known to lie about herself and her life, so no one really knew the real Kate. On this March afternoon, her friends were astonished at the change in her. Before, she had been shabbily dressed, but at the door stood a self-assured and well-dressed woman in a silk dress. At her side was her son, and she was carrying a black canvas bag. Anne and Kate sat down, and Kate poured whiskey from her pocket and told Anne her story. She'd remarried and was now Mrs. Thompson, but her husband had recently passed away. The boy with her, she explained, was her son, John Webster, better known as Johnny, who'd been born on 18th April 1874 at Kingston upon Thames. She also went on to say that an aunt had also died, and in her will she had bequeathed Kate her house, one of a pair of cottages known as Vine Cottages, also known as Mayfield Cottages, in Park Road, Richmond. The property was a semi-detached 2-storey villa and sat near the public house, the Hole in the Wall. Later that evening, Harry and his son Robert accompanied Kate to the local railway station, stopping at various pubs on the way. Robert carried her bag, which he noted was quite heavy. During one drink, she excused herself, as she told them she had to drop off the bag to a friend in Barnes. She headed off over the Hammersmith Bridge, and 20 minutes later returned, without the bag. Robert went on to accompany her to No. 2 Vine Cottages, and when they arrived, Kate produced a heavy wooden box and asked if he would carry it for her, as it was for a friend she was meeting at Richmond Bridge. He did. She then took it from him, telling him to wait for her, and headed off over the bridge. A short time later, he heard a splash in the water. The following morning, a coal porter, Henry Wheatley, discovered a wooden box stuck in the mud near Barnes Bridge. Curious, he gave it a good kick, and it split open, displaying its contents. It contained human remains, wrapped in brown paper. At a post-mortem examination, it was concluded the body parts in the box had been boiled, but the head and foot were missing. The foot was later discovered on 10th March in a dung heap at allotments in Twickenham. What had made Kate's bag so heavy was presumed to be the head. The remains were buried at Barnes Cemetery on 19th March. In the meantime, Kate was getting all the furniture removed from 2 Vine Cottages. As it transpired, the house belonged to the next-door neighbour, Elizabeth Ives, and she became suspicious when on 18th March, delivery men were removing the furniture. She knew Kate was her neighbour and daughter, Julia Thomas's maid. But where was Julia? She confronted Kate after the man told her that Mrs. Thomas had sold it to John Church and pointed to Kate as Mrs. Thomas. She became agitated and fled, picking up her son from the porter's home where she'd left him and returned to Ireland, staying at her uncle's farm at Killaan, but the police were already after her. At the cottage, they discovered bloodstains, charred bones, and fatty matter, so an arrest warrant was issued for Kate. She was apprehended quickly and charged with the murder of Julia Martha Thomas. Julia Thomas was a former teacher and was a widow for the second time by the time Kate came to work for her. She was a well-dressed lady, but according to neighbours, she had an excitable temperament and was regarded as being eccentric. Although not by any means wealthy, she wanted to give the impression of being so, and having a maid employed would give her an air of respectability that the middle classes so enjoyed. However, her maid turnover was high, and on 29th January 1879, Kate became the latest in a long line she'd employed. This was at a time when Kate had just been released once more from prison. Her son had been looked after by her friend Sarah Crease, who worked for a Miss Loader, who knew Mrs. Thomas was looking for a maid at the time. It seems Kate didn't get on too well with her employer. Mrs. Thomas, who was around 54 years old, was set in her ways and liked things to be done in a certain manner, and this infuriated Kate. Kate later said, "At first I thought her a nice old lady, but I found her very trying, and she used to do many things to annoy me during my work. When I had finished my work in my rooms, she used to go over it again after me and point out places where she said I did not clean, showing evidence of a nasty spirit towards me." In the end, Mrs. Thomas, who by this time felt uncomfortable with Kate around, gave Kate her notice to leave on 28th February. However, Kate managed to persuade her to keep her on for another 3 days. When the woman returned from church on 2nd March, Kate snapped. What actually happened between them is unknown, but Kate claimed they'd argued at the top of some stairs and had pushed her down them. To stop her screaming, she'd then strangled her. Once she was dead, she dismembered her body, disposing of it in various locations. On 2nd July 1879, her 6-day trial began at the Old Bailey in London. Sir Hardinge Gifford, the Solicitor General, headed up the prosecution case, while Kate was defended by Warner Slay, a prominent London barrister. She pleaded not guilty, claiming it was a man called Strong, the alleged father of her son Johnny, but she was found guilty, thanks mainly to the testimony of bonnet maker Maria Durden. Kate had visited her the week before the murder, claiming she was going to sell furniture, jewellery and property left to her by an aunt. The murder, it seems, was premeditated. The judge, Justice George Denman, sentenced Kate to death by hanging, but trying to put it off for as long as she could, she feigned pregnancy, but the courts were having none of it. She was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on 29th July 1879, William Marwood carrying out his duty as executioner. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. On 22nd October 2010, while workmen were excavating the ground bought by Sir David Attenborough in Park Road, where the former hole-in-the-wall pub once stood, they discovered a skull. This was near to Mrs. Thomas's former home, and not far from the pub Kate and the porters had visited while on their pub crawl. It was sent for forensic analysis to the University of Edinburgh, and at an inquest on Tuesday 5th July 2011, it was confirmed by the West London coroner, Alison Thompson, to be the missing head of Julia Thomas. The verdict of unlawful killing was recorded. However, the discovery of the head poses a number of questions, the main one being, how did it get there? Who had Kate given the bag to that contained it? Was it this man Strong? Had he returned to the cottage to bury it? It's unlikely we'll ever know how it ended up there.